Welcome to the Babylonian Podcast. I'm Michael Light, and I'm a Second Temple Jewish literature junkie and a big-time Bible nerd. And on this podcast, I provide the perspective of Jews that lived just before Jesus, from texts that we have like the apocrypha, pseudepigrapha, Dead Sea Scrolls, Philo, and more. With scholars, sages, and scriptures, let's Bible on. Welcome back to Babylonia. In this episode, we will be continuing our season on the apocrypha. We have been going through all of the apocrypha, and so if you haven't been keeping up to date, you don't have to watch any of the episodes before this, except I would highly recommend that you listen to the first one on what the apocrypha is, and if you're interested in its canonicity, where it is in the Bible, or rather outside the Bible, go listen to episode 2 of how searching the scriptures on how the Hebrew Bible is put together. Also, all of this is going on my website, michaeljlight.com, and or you can just put thebabylonian.com, go to Works and Writings, and click on Apocrypha. There are summaries of all of these except for the next 3 episodes, as well as a couple of other just minor traditions that aren't really full texts on their own. In a sense, I'm not doing summaries of these just because they're not as independent, so as to say. So Esther, Letter, Jeremiah, these additions to Daniel, and about 2 more to come will not have their own written out summaries. However, the others do, and so that's nice, and also make sure to take advantage of that. Now, before I get into this episode, I'm going to say that this episode is part 1 of 3. Just like Esther as a whole had many different editions, some which were connected and some weren't. Now you can go listen to that episode if you want to. You don't need to, but I'm kind of going to give a comparison here between Esther and Daniel. Esther has its own canonical version in the Protestant and Jewish traditions that's based completely on the Hebrew. However, if you're a Roman Catholic or any type of Orthodox Christian, then your Esther will contain parts only found in the later Greek texts that were probably other extra Esther traditions that were added on, multiple ones. For example, there's one tradition where where Mordecai is given an apocalyptic vision of this dragon and this it tormenting the Jewish nation, and then a stream coming and washing it away before anything even happens. And at the end, he's given the interpretation of it, and he recognizes that the stream is Esther, that the dragon is Haman, and that the great nation is Israel. There are also other little alterations, such as the king being held back from sleeping because of God, and other little things that aren't necessarily part of the tradition that came with the Mordecai apocalypse. However, it's a little bit harder to take apart Esther and the different traditions there. You do see in especially some texts that label them edition A, edition B, edition C, edition D, that there are some additions, but there are also some changes, and those texts don't survive as well on their own. If you just take the Apocalypse of Mordecai, it doesn't survive on its own. But for Daniel does have 3 different editions found in the Septuagintal version, which is why this is LXX Daniel. LXX stands for, it's the Roman numerals for 70. So by the time that Daniel was translated into the Septuagint, these three editions were made in that Septuagintal version. And as the NRSV Apocrypha notes, even after the translation of Daniel into the Septuagint, which would have been in around the year 200 is what they're saying, by 100 there was an altered version of even some of these to make it align more with Daniel because it actually contradicts it some. However, that's not that big of a difference. And we're not going to be getting way too in-depth into these because these are more minor than the other Apocrypha. And so, anyways, there was an original Hebrew and Aramaic Daniel, and then later there were other editions, two of which could have been just totally outside of the idea of Daniel even being this prophet in the Hebrew Bible. It could have been just traditions that people had before they were even aware of the book of Daniel, possibly. I'm not even sure that's what these people say. However, it's very possible because Daniel's given a totally different role. And you'll see that as we get to those texts. The thing about the additions to Daniel is that we don't have them as separate texts. However, by this time, like I said, some of them, the two after this, can stand on their own. However, this one is more just obviously an alteration, an expansion of the canonical Daniel. But the other two can just completely stand on their own. However, they weren't given the names that I'm going to be giving them in this podcast season, except later by scholars. So you have the Prayer of Azariah and the Song of the Three Jews. Then you have Susanna. And then you have Bel and the Dragon. These are three different major additions added to Daniel. And they didn't have these names until later. So, anyways, if that's confusing, then just listen to the next two podcasts, and then you should be able to understand. But anyways, this first one that we're going to be getting into in this episode is called the Prayer of Azariah and the Song of the Three Jews. Again, this is a name that scholars later have given to this section in Septuagintal Daniel. However, that's not an original name given to it. And if you couldn't tell by the title, this edition is a prayer that is prayed by Azariah, who is one of the three Jews that's thrown into the fiery furnace. They're better known by their Babylonian names, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But they all pray together, and Azariah leads them in prayer and in a blessing that's very much connected to Daniel chapter 9 and their confession for the sins of Israel and their sins as they're thrown into the fire. There are also connections to prayers from verses from Genesis, like the Kedah story where Abraham offers up Isaac. They recount that God promised to multiply them like the stars, and they make multiple references to the Psalms, of course, because it's a prayer and a blessing, some to Exodus and the Kings. And it's just a prayer asking for God to it's a blessing to God, and then it's a prayer asking for God to forgive Israel of their sins that brought them into exile in the first place. And actually, as I'm re-referencing the Oxford Annotated Apocrypha in front of me, these hymns, these prayers, there's two of them. There's first the one that's led by Azariah. It starts in verse 1 and says that they walked around in the midst of the flames, singing hymns to God and blessing the Lord. And then Azariah stood in the fire and prayed aloud. And the prayer that he says does not actually give away any of the context of what's happening in them being in the flames. By the way, this is between Daniel chapter 3:23 and 3:24. If you're reading in a Roman Catholic Bible, for example, that just has this inserted in. So that's the beginning. And then in between the two prayers, it says, "Now the king's servants who threw them Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, in the inn kept stroking the furnace with naphtha, pitch, tow, and brushwood. And the flames poured out above the furnace 49 cubits, and spread out and burned those Chaldeans who were caught near the furnace. But the angel of the Lord came down into the furnace to be with Azariah and his companions, and drove the fiery flame out of the furnace, and made the inside of the furnace as though a moist wind were whistling through it. The fire did not touch them at all, and caused them no pain or distress. And then the three with one voice praised and glorified and blessed God in the furnace. And then this blessing also does not give any context, any clues as to this actually being original to the Daniel story. So really, these two hymns could have been just give us an image into what the liturgy or the regular prayers of Jews in the time of the writing of this would have looked like. And because it's connected to Daniel 9 and such, it, at least by the later editors, this actually could have been prayers prayed around the time of the desecration of the temple during the Maccabean revolt, which we will get to when we start talking about 1 and 2 Maccabees. So make sure to listen to that when it comes out. But pretty much the Jews were under a lot of persecution, and there were a lot of unfaithful Jews, and they saw that persecution as coming upon them, especially because of those unfaithful Jews, in the same way that Israel and Judah in the first place were brought into exile because of the Jews that were unfaithful. So let me explain it like this. There are two major, let's say, hymns, and these hymns are passed on, and these people, later people, take these hymns and they write an introduction to it that add it into the context of Daniel chapter 3. And they also expand just a little bit upon Daniel 3 and what's actually happening there. For them, they explain the angel of the Lord coming to be in the furnace, which is, of course, the one like the sons of God that Nebuchadnezzar, I think it is, calls out and claims to have seen. So that's kind of the idea, at least the scholars behind this translation, that is Amy C. Merrill Willis, is saying that she believes. And it makes a lot of sense, since there are no references to any of the context in these actual hymns. And another interesting thing in this is that it says, in our day we have no ruler or prophet or leader, no burnt offering or sacrifice or oblation or incense, no place to make an offering before you and to find mercy. Which is another reason why this could be seen as a hymn from around the time of the Maccabean revolt, when the Jews were under persecution and they weren't allowed to make sacrifice in the temple because it was taken over. And also the idea that there's no prophet, that prophecy had ceased. And now, in Christian debates today, this can be a whole argument as to whether or not there's been an undermining of scriptural authority and people throwing scripture out. And I'm not going to get into that whole debate because that's besides the point here. The point is, these people, the authors of this hymn, at least believed that there was an end to prophecy. And that is actually a debate around that time, because of course there was the apocalyptic movement, and apocalypticism just means revelation. So there was a whole argument between who believed that there was some type of divine inspiration. And we're not talking about writing new books of the Bible, but we're talking about God revealing himself and there being prophets. And on the anti-prophet side, you have, we've already seen Ben Sira, and now we see this Prayer of Azariah and the Three Jews, and we will continue to see more texts that talk about that. But that is definitely not the only view, as we see in other pseudepigrapha. So it's also important for that. Now, I'm not going to read the hymns, the prayers themselves, This whole section, as it is just 68 verses, so about the size of 2 regular Bible chapters. So you could read it in less than 5 minutes if you're interested, and get a better understanding for Jews around the time of the Maccabees. And so maybe you're interested in thinking, what were the Maccabees? What is the Maccabean revolt that you keep referring to? I will, of course, get into that later when we get to 1 and 2 Maccabees. Which is not next. Next is actually Susanna, and another addition to the Septuagintal Daniel. But before that, we'll take a break. And if you enjoy this podcast, make sure to give it a good review. And it really helps if you share it with others. And I cannot wait to see you again next week in Babylonia.